to go from there. So with that, let's get started. So hey everybody, my name is Christopher Callis, and today we're going to be talking about monitoring for compliance in the cloud. This is part one of a three-part series in which we will help you make informed decisions when architecting for security and compliance in the cloud, explore proven strategies and technologies to ensure that your organization's security intent is reflected in your workloads security posture, learn about technologies that will allow you to measure and enforce compliance requirements, build upon what we learn. We're going to introduce automation and explore how it can be built into your workloads to help meet technical, legal, and regulatory compliance requirements. Just a side note, this webinar builds upon the basics that were covered in our Cloud Security 101 series called Getting Back to Basics, webinars and talks that we've done. So please check out our website above for more information and previous broadcasts. So a little bit about me. Before I started up the cloud security practice at Tevora, I ran the PCI side of the house and was responsible for everything PCI, PADSS, and point-to-point encryption. A couple of years back, we had an increase in clients requesting for us to actually review their cloud workloads as they began their cloud migration journey. Naturally, they wanted their QSA's input, so they knew there weren't going to be any hiccups during an actual assessment itself. So we would spend time architecting the workloads, selecting the appropriate services, and spend a lot of time helping them understand their roles and responsibilities in a shared responsibility model. Speaking of shared responsibility, we covered this in the previous webinars, but this is crucial. If you have a cloud service provider that you're considering and they can't give you a document with clear responsibilities and what your roles are within their environment, probably best to run away. So over the last couple of years, the cloud stuff got big and it led to us actually formalizing the cloud practice. And now I'm here with you to share this knowledge. So as we've been doing this, there's been a couple of interesting findings. As everybody's kind of migrated over to the cloud, the developer teams and stuff like that have taken the opportunity to really embrace a DevOps type shop. However, once we kind of dig past the surface a little bit, we have found that compliance is still a very manual process. So, the security teams we deal with, they kind of feel like, hey, here's you with the auditor itself, and then here's this cloud DevOps thing. And this is something that we feel needs to change, because how are you going to be able to demonstrate compliance, when your developers start really trying to position new workloads that maybe don't have SSH shells or stuff like that, and you don't really have the audit capabilities. I mean, you start being put into the predicament where it's like, should you temporarily make your environment less secure so an auditor can actually gather their samples? The entire concept of this DevSecOps was to really keep people away from the data and away from production itself. So really this whole manual process feels wrong. So apart from, compliance being manual, we're running into a lot of organizations that are really feeling this audit fatigue. They have these new technologies that they're dealing with. They're not sure what their roles and responsibilities are, and they're not going into their, assessment cycles with confidence. The controls are where they need to be, or maybe even have a strong understanding of the controls. So everyone's kind of having this Groundhog Day effect, especially, when your assessment periods don't line up and you feel like, hey, I think I've submitted this evidence before. What's going on? So that brings us to what we're going to be covering today. Today, we're going to be covering topics to help reduce that anxiety and audit fatigue, and look at some tools that will create a foundation which will allow you to practice event data-driven security. The first tool we're going to be taking a look at is CloudTrails. This is recorded API activity that passes through your AWS control plane. These are similar to your critical infrastructure logs. It records user actions and anything that really passes through that AWS API control plane. The next service we're going to take a look at is AWS Config. This is a fully managed service that provides you with a AWS resource inventory, configuration history, and configuration change notifications, which enables security and governance. And the last tool we're going to be taking a look at is Inspector. This is a security assessment tool that helps you improve the security and compliance of applications deployed in AWS. It could do things like perform vulnerability scans, check your systems and networking against hardening standards, as well as various other functions. So with that, let's take a look. The first service we're going to take a look at is CloudTrails. This is recorded API activity that passes through your AWS control plane. These are similar to your critical infrastructure logs. It records user actions via API, S3 bucket actions, and so on.
As you can see here, we have the ability to create a trail and some recent events that actually occurred, which we're going to be digging into in a second. Here in the trails, we can confirm that there are no cloud trails enabled. Let's take a look at those events one more time. We're getting really useful information here. Things such as root console logins, access key creation, user policy attachments. What else are we getting? We're getting bucket policy creation, access key creation, users actually being created. A lot of really great information that allows us to take action and investigate security events. And then in the future, layer on automation on top of it. Next, what we're going to do is actually create a trail. We're going to give our trail a name. Let's do something original like lab trail events. We're going to make sure it's applied to all regions. This is something that we're going to cover in future, more advanced topics. Management events here is something that I want to point out. You want to capture all read and write API activity. So make sure you select all. This is something that we frequently see people either select, read only or write only. If you only get half of the piece of the puzzle, it's really hard to do an investigation on that. So make sure that all is selected. Next area here, we have data events, S3 and Lambda. This allows us to start layering on automation on top of the cloud trails. This is out of scope for today's subject, but we will be covering it, I believe, in webinar 2 of the series. And the last thing that we need to do here is create a storage location. I'm going to create a new S3 bucket, give it a unique name here, and that's it. Now we see that the lab trail events cloud trail is enabled. Cloud trail is one of those things that we see commonly misconfigured. Generally, what will happen is an administrator will simply check the box in a service like S3 and think that all events are going to be captured. The issue with this is without actually having CloudTrail enabled, the retention is only for 7 days, which may get you in trouble with some compliance requirements. Once we configure the actual CloudTrail itself, we're able to configure retention to meet compliance and security requirements. Again, what CloudTrail allows us to do is perform a root cause analysis. It gives us near real-time intrusion detection. It facilitates security and compliance requirements, and it logs all API activity for supported services. Next, what we're going to do is we're going to use CloudFormation to quickly deploy a LAMP stack so that we get some activity from the environment here shortly. We're going to be exploring tools like CloudFormation and Terraform in future webinars when we dive more into being able to consistently deploy an environment by leveraging infrastructure as code. We're going to give the stack a name here. Set the database password, the database root password, the database user password. We're going to use a T2 micro container. We're going to select the SSH keys that I've already deployed throughout the environment. We're going to apply some tags, which we'll cover in future webinars. We're going to leave the IAM role blank for right now and leave rollback triggers blank as well. We'll be covering those in future sessions when we're layering automation on top of our environment. And finally, we're going to create the stack by clicking on Create. This process takes about 15-20 minutes, so we'll see you guys when we get back. Next, we're going to take a look at AWS Config. This is a fully managed service that provides you with a variety of benefits such as resource inventory, configuration history and drift detection, configuration change notifications, all allowing you to enable security and governance within the cloud. The first thing we're going to do is add a rule. You have the option to utilize an AWS managed rule, or you could create one yourself. Today, we're going to leverage an AWS managed rule. Let's select CloudTrail Watch Logs Enabled. This will allow us to ensure CloudTrail is enabled, allowing you to maintain compliance. The trigger selection allows you to specify when you want config to evaluate the rule. Ideally, we want it enabled for configuration changes. That way, if somebody disables CloudTrail, it will get an alert when the change is made rather than being run manually. We're going to skip rule parameters for now, as well as remediation action items. This would allow us to accomplish things like leveraging automation to remediate an event. This will be covered in upcoming webinars. Next, we're going to hit save. And AWS config will start evaluating the environment for compliance. Since that was so much fun, let's configure a couple of other rules. Which one should we choose? Let's see. I know. Let's do something with SSH. Let's do restricted SSH. This will check to ensure security groups and use disallow unrestricted SSH, which we all know is something that no one would ever do. Again, we specify the trigger actions. We want to use configuration change and establish the scope as all resources within an EC2 security group. We're going to leave the remediation actions alone for this webinar. And let's hit save and allow AWS config to start evaluating the new rule as well. And as those are running, let's set up one more rule. Let's do something with the VPC. And let's do something that we run across a lot, is not having the default security group within the VPC closed. Again, we can see the description, which checks for default security groups within the VPC. And same as before, we're going to leave the trigger and the remediation actions as they are. And we're going to hit save. Now that we have 3 rules created, let's take a look at the config dashboard. See how it's changed from not just having a resource count, but showing you rules that were evaluated and what resources are flagged as being non-compliant. Let's take a look at some of those non-compliant rules. Let's start with the VPC default security group not being closed. In the top, we could see a description of what the actual rule is, the trigger type, the scopes, the resource type, all things that we were able to configure when we were actually establishing the rule itself. When you scroll down a little bit, you could see the resources that are in violation of the actual rule. We could see here it's security group that ends in 882. You gotta love being logged out of your session. Let's get these screens refreshed, and let's resolve some of these non-compliant rules. Back in the default security group, we could see that there is indeed rules that are applied. So let's edit that rule, and let's remove the all traffic ephemeral port and save. Let's do the same thing with outbound rule. Let's remove it here and save. Remember earlier in the webinar when we talked about how AWS CloudTrail happens in near real time? We're about to get an example of what that actually looks like. So let's reevaluate the rule here using the magic of video processing and speeding up the actual timeline. We could see here that the events are evaluating, and about 15 minutes later, we're able to take a look at the dashboard and see that the non-compliant default VPC security group rule has been remediated. To recap, AWS config allows you to have an accurate resource inventory, provides you with a configuration history, allows for drift detection, provides the ability to have configuration change notifications, and allows you to enforce security and compliance within your cloud environment. The AWS Linux AMI is a great image that is hardened to CIS standards. The issues organizations run into is the CIS standard is a weight-based standard designed for you to customize hardening efforts to your organization's risk tolerance. It's a great baseline, but still requires some work. In future webinars, we're going to cover how to consistently provision these images to your organization's policy via code. When we log in, we can see that we're operating as EC2 user, which is paired to our SSH keys. This is a big step up from running as root. Next, we're going to take a look at the users on the system. It's great to see all these accounts with all their shells pulled. There's 27 total accounts, and there's 21 accounts with their shells actually pulled. This is awesome. Now let's take a look at the software updates. This is something that we see a lot in the field. It's hard to get a sense of the patch history since most organizations move towards a cattle versus pet type shop. This is where the tools like Inspector come in handy if you're required to be SOC 2 or ISO compliant and need to demonstrate compliance over time. Next, we're going to test out the verbosity of the logging. Generally, Red Hat will capture the escalation to root, but nothing much after that. Let's populate these logs with some events. First thing we're going to do is cat the shadow file. This is great. Not seeing any weak hashes in use. We do see that the root account is locked, but since we did have a shell assigned with it, I was able to escalate my privileges to root. Next, let's take a look at the SSH config. A couple things jump out at me here. Looks like some items are managed by SC Linux, so need to brush up on that a little bit to manage some of the rules. We see that permit root login allows for forced command only, so sure there's better approaches to how we could accomplish this, but overall it looks pretty good. Next, we're going to take a look at the listening services. Looks like expected services based on the LAMP stack that we applied via CloudFormation. Not sure about the send mail though. And the only thing established is our SSH session. So that's good. Next, we're going to take a look at the PAMD configuration. PARMD. PAMD is one of those things where, a lot of organizations will have systems federated to their Active Directory, but then we'll see local accounts that are enabled, allowing other methods to actually gain access. So these are one of those important things to check. By default, we can see it has strong hashes, but password complexity is still lacking. Next, we're going to take a look at the logs to confirm that we're getting the verbosity that we need for the privileged actions. So we're going to grep through the log file for some commands that we ran as root, just to see if it's actually getting captured. And it is, which is great. The last thing we're going to do is install the Inspector agent. In future webinars, we're going to automate the deployment of the agent. Here, we're just going to manually install it, following the AWS provided instructions. And that's it. It is installed. Next, we're going to actually go into Inspector and run an assessment. Again, AWS Inspector is a security assessment tool that helps you improve the security and compliance of applications deployed within AWS. It can do things like perform vulnerability scans, hardening checks, as well as various other functions. The first thing that you need to do in Inspector is create an assessment. But doing that with the wizard does not really teach us anything. So we're going to go through this manually. The first thing that we need to do is review the targets. Those are the systems with Inspector agents installed. And what I did here was already create an established target. And what we want to do is preview them. And we can see that the agent that we just installed is reporting to AWS Inspector is healthy. Next, we need to create an assessment template. This is what we want to check the targets against. AWS provides some basic templates, and there are many more that you can find online as well as create your own. We're going to select Create. And we're going to give our assessment template a name. Next, we're going to select the targets, and we're going to apply some rules packages. Let's do CIS hardening, and let's do a vulnerability scan. And we're going to select security best practices as well. We're going to keep our duration set to 1 hour, and we're going to keep SNS topics disabled. As you can see, if you have good tag hygiene, you can do things like limit the scan between production and non-production systems. Next, we're going to actually run the assessment and come back in just a little bit to take a look at the results.
So Inspector provides the results in a couple of different ways. The way that I'm going to show you here today is via the PDF report from the scan that we just did. Inspector, in future webinars, we're going to actually go into the panel. We're going to take a look at how the reports, how the scans actually represent themselves within Inspector itself, and then also layer on top of automation to either give you guys the ability to either have a stop gate to make a decision on what you want to do, or to have it automatically remediate depending on what the finding is. But by default, as you can see here in the executive summary, just scanning the stock EC2 instance against the CIS benchmark and current CVEs came back with 95 items on the CIS benchmark and 22 high items on CVEs. Now, with the CIS benchmark itself, like we were talking about earlier, it's a weighted standard. So, that can fluctuate quite a bit depending on, what your organization's hardening standards have been established as. So that's something to keep in mind. And since Inspector does allow you to go in and adjust or make your own type of assessment, you could easily, create a CIS benchmark against, your own organization standards, and then maybe even tie additional controls around it to ensure that you didn't miss anything from a compliance perspective. So in the beginning of the webinar, we discussed issues with audit fatigue and manual security compliance efforts. Instead of architecting workloads for security and compliance from scratch, security is usually out of the loop and not brought in until products are ready to be released into production. This leads to an increased probability that there will be findings. Developers need to be focused on remediation efforts instead of the workload at hand, and your competition potentially getting to market first. One thing we aid organizations with is shifting to a DevSecOps model by leveraging well-architected standards. This framework is built with security and compliance in mind, yielding many benefits. One major advantage it provides is putting security at the table during architecture. This provides the opportunity for all teams to discuss what they need out of the workload and to understand the technology portfolio that's being designed, as well as their team's responsibility for maintaining it once it's actually in production. So although currently, we're finding many security and compliance teams performing, a lot of their shared responsibility and security, responsibilities manually, we hope that this webinar series will lay the foundation to change that. So thanks everybody for attending.